Welcome to Drowsworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the Chernobyl disaster, a catastrophe so catastrophic that you definitely wouldn't survive it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about the invisible killer that turned an entire city into a ghost town in under 36 hours. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. Get comfortable. Maybe turn down the lights. Let the gentle hum of a fan wash over you. We're about to step into April 26th, 1986, and you're about to discover why being a hero at Chernobyl meant signing your own death warrant. It's 1:23 in the morning. You're a firefighter in Pripyat, a model Soviet city just 3 kilometers from the Vladimir Lenin nuclear power plant. You've been asleep for maybe 3 hours when the alarm shatters the silence of your small apartment. Your training kicks in immediately. You pull on your gear, standard issue firefighter equipment, canvas coat, rubber boots, a helmet. You have no idea that what you're wearing might as well be made of paper for all the protection it will offer against what's waiting for you. The truck races through empty streets, and then you see it. A pillar of light shooting into the night sky from reactor number 4. Beautiful in a terrible way, glowing blue and white, brighter than anything you've ever seen. You don't know it yet, but you're looking at ionized air, at radiation so intense it's making the atmosphere itself luminous. Your colleagues are joking nervously, making comments about how it looks like a rocket launch. Someone mentions that the air tastes metallic. You notice it too, like you've been sucking on a handful of pennies. Your throat feels scratchy. You assume it's from sleep, from being jolted awake. You're wrong. The reactor building is a nightmare made real. The explosion, there were actually 2. One conventional steam explosion, followed by a nuclear explosion, has blown 1,000-ton steel and concrete lid clean off the reactor core. It's the infamous reactor lid that cameras would later capture standing vertically, leaning at an angle in the destroyed building. But right now, in this moment, you're not thinking about what caused this or the physics involved. You're thinking about the fire. Graphite is burning. 30 tons of it are scattered across the reactor building roof, each chunk glowing red hot, each piece lethally radioactive. The core itself, now exposed to the night air, is burning at over 2,000 degrees Celsius. You don't understand that the black chunks scattered everywhere are graphite moderator blocks from the reactor core itself. They look like coal. Some of your colleagues pick them up with their bare hands to throw them off the roof, trying to prevent the fire from spreading. Their hands begin to tan, to darken within minutes. You feel warmth on your face, more intense than any fire you've fought before. What you're experiencing is acute radiation syndrome beginning in real time. Your skin is absorbing radiation. Your cells are being torn apart at the molecular level. The warmth isn't just from the fire. It's from your own tissue being destroyed from the inside out. The radiation levels where you're standing are approximately 20,000 Röntgens per hour. To put that in perspective, 400 Röntgens over your whole body is enough to kill half of those exposed. You're getting 50 times the lethal dose every hour. In the most contaminated areas, near the core itself, levels are reaching 30,000 Röntgens per hour. You would die from this exposure in less than 2 minutes, but you don't know any of this. You've been told it's a fire, just a fire. Put it out and go home. You aim your hose at the burning graphite. The water seems to evaporate before it even touches the flames. The heat is incredible. Your face feels sunburnt. Your eyes are watering. That metallic taste is stronger now. And there's something else, a strange sensation, almost like your teeth are vibrating. This is radiation interacting with the nerve endings in your mouth. Your body is screaming warnings at you in a language you don't understand. The worst part is the silence about what's really happening. The plant supervisor, Anatoly Dyatlov, is still in the control room insisting the reactor core is intact. He's screaming at operators who dare suggest otherwise, calling them idiots, threatening their jobs. This denial will cost lives. The firefighters arriving on scene are told they're dealing with a conventional fire, maybe a hydrogen explosion in the electrical systems. Nobody uses the word reactor. Nobody says meltdown. Nobody warns you that you're standing in what amounts to an open nuclear furnace. Your watch, a simple mechanical timepiece, is already being affected. If you looked closely, you'd see the luminous dial glowing brighter than normal. The radiation is exciting the phosphorescent paint. In the coming weeks, as your personal effects are collected and analyzed, this watch will be so contaminated it will need to be buried as nuclear waste. Everything you're wearing, everything you're touching, is becoming permanently radioactive. The rubber soles of your boots are beginning to stick to the roof surface. The heat is melting them, but it's more than that. The radiation is breaking down the molecular bonds in the rubber, turning it soft and tacky. With each step, you leave behind a slightly radioactive footprint. Decades later, these footprints will still be visible, still hot enough to set off radiation detectors. Around you, your fellow firefighters are starting to show symptoms. Someone vomits. Another man sits down suddenly, looking confused. The chief is shouting orders, but his voice sounds strange, slurred. You notice his face looks red, flushed, like he's been in the sun for hours. It's been less than 30 minutes since you arrived. You're standing on a roof that's essentially a radioactive crematorium. Below you, in the destroyed reactor hall, the core is exposed. Uranium dioxide fuel is burning, releasing a plume of radioactive particles into the atmosphere. Iodine 131, cesium 137, strontium 90, plutonium 239, dozens of isotopes, each deadly in its own way, are billowing into the night sky. You're breathing this in with every breath. The canvas mask you've pulled over your face, standard firefighting equipment, is doing absolutely nothing to protect you. Your colleague, Leonid Chevry, is working next to you. He's 24 years old, married, with a young daughter. In a few hours, he'll be admitted to the hospital with severe radiation burns. In 2 weeks, he'll be dead. But right now, he's joking about the strange taste in the air, saying it reminds him of the cheap wine you all drank last week at his birthday party. The lieutenant, Vladimir Provic, is coordinating the effort from the roof. He's the best officer in the brigade, calm under pressure, experienced. He's also absorbing a lethal dose of radiation every few minutes. His body is already beginning the process of shutting down. His bone marrow is dying. The cells that produce blood, that fight infection, that keep him alive, are being destroyed. In 18 days, he'll die in a Moscow hospital. His body so radioactive that even the medical staff can only spend limited time near him. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to that horrific night at Chernobyl. You've been fighting the fire for an hour now. Your legs feel weak. The nausea that you've been fighting is getting worse. You finally give in and vomit over the side of the building. Your skin itches everywhere, a maddening sensation that no amount of scratching helps. You look at your hands in the glow of the fire. They look dark, tanned, which makes no sense because it's the middle of the night. This is radiation burn happening in real time. The civilian firefighters from Pripyat have now been joined by military units, but the scene is chaos. Nobody knows what they're dealing with. The plant managers are in denial, some insisting that the reactor is intact, that this is just a conventional fire. The dosimeters, the radiation detection devices, are maxing out immediately. The highest reading they can show is 3.6 Rentgen per hour. The operators assume this means that's the actual radiation level. It's not. It's more like 10,000 times that in some places. The equipment simply can't measure radiation this high. It's like trying to measure the sun with a thermometer that only goes up to 100 degrees. You're ordered to help carry hoses into the reactor building itself. The stairwells are filled with smoke, with steam, with invisible death. Each step takes you closer to the exposed core. The radiation is so intense that it's creating a physical sensation, a pressure, a heaviness in the air. Workers who will later analyze this night describe feeling like they were walking through thick syrup, like the air itself had become viscous. This is your nervous system beginning to fail. In the basement levels below, water from your fire hoses is accumulating. There's a very real danger that this water will come into contact with the molten fuel from the reactor, which is beginning to burn through the concrete floor of the reactor hall. If that happens, the resulting steam explosion could trigger a thermal blast that would destroy the other 3 reactors at the plant and render an area the size of France uninhabitable for centuries. But you don't know this. You're just fighting a fire, doing your job, being a hero in the way Soviet heroes are supposed to be, selfless, brave, uncomplaining. The air in the reactor building is thick with radioactive dust. Every breath coats your lungs with particles of uranium, plutonium, americium. These particles will remain in your lungs for the rest of your life, however long that turns out to be, continuously irradiating the surrounding tissue. Lung cancer, if you survive the immediate radiation poisoning, is almost guaranteed. Your eyes are burning now. Radiation is damaging the surface of your corneas. Some firefighters this night will develop cataracts within days. The lens of the eye is particularly sensitive to radiation, and you've just taken enough to guarantee yours will cloud over, turning milky white, stealing your vision. By 3 in the morning, you can barely stand. Your commanding officer finally orders you down, back to the trucks. You've been on the roof for nearly 2 hours. You've absorbed somewhere between 400 and 1,000 Rentgens of radiation, maybe more. The lethal dose is 400. You're a dead man walking, though you don't know it yet. In the truck back to the fire station, you're shaking uncontrollably. Your skin feels like it's on fire. Someone offers you water, but the thought of drinking makes you nauseous. Another firefighter has already passed out, slumped against the side of the truck. His face is so swollen that he's barely recognizable. At the station, you're told to wash, to change clothes. You strip off your contaminated gear. Your skin underneath is bright red, like a severe sunburn. Dark patches are already forming. These are areas where radiation exposure was most intense. In the coming days, these patches will blister, will weep, will slough off entirely, revealing raw flesh underneath. A few hours later, you're in the Pripyat hospital. The doctors are overwhelmed. They've never seen anything like this. You're vomiting continuously now. Bloody diarrhea has started. Your temperature is spiking. The headache is so intense you can barely see. This is acute radiation syndrome in full effect. Your body is breaking down at the cellular level. The medical staff doesn't understand the danger they're in. They're treating you with standard protocols, spending extended time at your bedside. They don't realize your body is radioactive, that your vomit, your blood, your sweat, everything is contaminated. Some of these nurses and doctors will later show symptoms of radiation exposure themselves. By afternoon on April 26th, You and your fellow firefighters are being evacuated to Moscow, to Hospital Number 6, the only facility in the Soviet Union equipped to handle radiation casualties. The flight is agony. Every movement sends waves of pain through your body. Your skin is starting to come off in sheets. At Hospital Number 6, they have a special unit, a clean room where radiation victims are isolated. You're placed in a bed. Specialists examine you. They measure your radiation dose through biological indicators, through chromosome damage in your blood cells. The results are catastrophic. Your bone marrow is dead. This means your body can no longer produce blood cells. You'll need constant transfusions to survive. Your immune system is gone. Any infection, even a common cold, could kill you. The radiation has damaged your DNA so severely that your cells can no longer repair themselves, can no longer divide normally. In the days that come, your condition deteriorates in ways that are almost medieval in their horror. Your skin continues to slough off. Your mouth and throat develop ulcers so severe you cannot eat or drink. Your digestive system begins to break down, the lining of your intestines dying, causing unstoppable diarrhea that's mixed with blood and pieces of your own intestinal lining. The pain is beyond description. Morphine barely touches it. You're conscious through most of this, aware, trapped in a body that's destroying itself from the inside out. Some of the firefighters from that night will survive. Viktor Kabenik, the shift commander, will not. He'll die on May 11th. His body so destroyed by radiation that he's buried in a lead coffin sealed with concrete. Vasily Ignatenko, another young firefighter, will die in Moscow after weeks of unspeakable suffering. His pregnant wife by his side, absorbing radiation from his dying body, radiation that will kill their unborn child. 28 people will die in the immediate aftermath of Chernobyl from acute radiation syndrome. All but 2 of them are firefighters and plant workers from that first night. They died doing their jobs, following orders, being heroes. They also died because nobody told them the truth about what they were facing. You wouldn't have survived being a Chernobyl first responder because survival wasn't possible. The radiation levels were too high, the exposure too direct, the protective equipment too inadequate. These men walked into the most radioactive environment in human history, wearing canvas and rubber. They might as well have been naked. The cruel irony is that their sacrifice, their terrible deaths, likely prevented something even worse. By putting out the conventional fires, by preventing the spread to other reactor units, they contained the disaster to 1 reactor instead of 4. Estimates suggest that if all 4 Chernobyl reactors had been destroyed, the radioactive release would have been 4 times larger, rendering much of Europe uninhabitable. They saved millions of lives by giving up their own. They just didn't know that's what they were doing. They thought they were fighting a fire. Valery Legasov, the scientist who knew too much the story of Chernobyl, isn't just about the explosion, about the firefighters who rushed toward the flames. It's also about the aftermath, about the cover-up, about the scientists who had to navigate a system that valued propaganda over truth. And no one embodied that struggle more than Valery Legasov, the chief scientist tasked with investigating the disaster. On April 26, 1986, while firefighters were dying on the roof of Reactor 4, Legasov was in Moscow preparing for a completely ordinary day. He was the first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, one of the most prestigious positions in Soviet science. At 49 years old, he was at the peak of his career, a devoted communist, a believer in the system, a man who had spent his entire professional life serving the Soviet nuclear program. Then the phone rang. It was just after dawn when he received the call summoning him to the Kremlin. A major accident at Chernobyl. They needed experts immediately. Legusov grabbed his briefcase, kissed his wife goodbye, and headed out the door. He had no idea he would spend the next 2 years of his life consumed by this disaster, that it would cost him his career, his health, his faith in everything he believed in, and ultimately his life. The first meeting at the Kremlin was surreal. Legusov sat in a room with the most powerful men in the Soviet Union, listening to conflicting reports about what had happened. Some said the reactor was intact. Others said there had been a fire. The most alarming reports, the ones suggesting the reactor core itself had been destroyed, were dismissed as panic, as exaggeration. Legusov knew nuclear physics. He understood what an RBMK reactor was, how it worked, what could go wrong. And as he listened to the descriptions, the blue light in the sky, the pieces of graphite scattered across the site, the extreme radiation readings, a cold certainty settled over him. The core was gone, destroyed, burning in the open air. This was unprecedented. No reactor in history had ever been completely destroyed like this. The 3 Mile Island accident in America had been bad, but the containment had held. The reactor had been damaged, but not destroyed. Chernobyl was different. The reactor was open to the sky, spewing radiation directly into the atmosphere. Within hours, Legusov was on a plane to Kiev, then a helicopter to Pripyat. He arrived to a scene of controlled chaos. The city was still occupied. 30,000 people going about their Saturday, children playing in parks, families shopping, everyone breathing air thick with invisible death. The authorities hadn't ordered an evacuation yet. They were still gathering information, still debating, still hoping this wasn't as bad as it seemed. Legusov stood on a rooftop several kilometers from the reactor and looked at the destroyed building through binoculars. He could see the glow, could see the smoke rising from the core. His dosimeter was clicking steadily. They were being irradiated, just standing here, kilometers away from the source. He turned to the officials with him and said something that would define the rest of his life. We need to evacuate the city, now, today. The pushback was immediate. Evacuate, that would cause panic. It would be an admission that something terrible had happened. It would make the Soviet Union look weak, incompetent. Better to wait, to assess, to be sure, Legusov insisted. He explained the radiation levels, the danger, the wind patterns that were carrying contamination across the region. He used every bit of his authority, his reputation, his scientific knowledge to convince them. Finally, reluctantly, they agreed, but not immediately. The evacuation would happen the next day, Sunday. They needed time to organize buses, to prepare, to craft the right message. Legusov knew that every hour of delay meant more exposure, more contamination, more future cancers, but he had won a partial victory. The city would be evacuated. That night, Legusov barely slept. He was already beginning to formulate a plan for dealing with the disaster. The exposed reactor core was still burning. It needed to be smothered, covered, contained. But how do you fight a fire that's radioactive? How do you approach something that kills you just by being near it? The solution they arrived at was brutally simple. Helicopter crews would fly over the reactor and drop materials onto the burning core. Sand to smother the fire, boron to absorb neutrons and prevent further nuclear reactions, lead to provide shielding, clay to absorb heat and create a barrier. It was a desperate plan, and Legusov knew it. The helicopter crews would be flying directly over the most radioactive spot on Earth. Even with the speed of the passes, even with the altitude, they would absorb dangerous doses of radiation. But what choice did they have? The bombing runs began on April 27th. Military helicopter pilots, most of them veterans of Afghanistan, flew mission after mission over the reactor. They could only make a few passes before their radiation exposure became too dangerous. Then they would be rotated out and fresh crews would take over. Legusov watched from the command post as tons of material were dumped onto Reactor 4. It seemed to be working. The visible glow was diminishing. The temperature readings were dropping. But then a new problem emerged. The massive weight of all that material, thousands of tons of sand and lead and clay, was pressing down on the reactor structure. The building beneath, already damaged by the explosion, was beginning to collapse. And beneath the reactor hall were basement levels, flooded with water from the firefighting efforts. If the molten reactor core burned through the floor and hit that water, the resulting steam explosion would be catastrophic. This scenario, which Legusov and his team calculated carefully, became known as the China Syndrome scenario, borrowed from the American term. The explosion wouldn't literally send the core through the earth to China, but it would be big enough to destroy the other 3 reactors at Chernobyl and spread contamination across a massive area. Estimates suggested 3 to 5 megatons of force. Millions of people would need to be evacuated. Large portions of Ukraine and Belarus would become uninhabitable. Someone had to drain the water from those basement levels. Someone had to go into the flooded corridors beneath a melting reactor core and open the valves that would release the water. 3 men volunteered. Alexei Ananenko and Valery Bispolov, both engineers who knew the plant layout, and Boris Baranov, who would provide light. They put on wetsuits, not because it would provide any radiation protection, but because they would be wading through chest-deep water. They were each given a diving lamp and a dosimeter. Legusov briefed them personally. He explained the stakes, the danger, what they needed to do. He didn't sugarcoat it. They would be absorbing lethal doses of radiation, but if they succeeded, they would save millions of lives. The 3 men descended into the flooded basement on the night of May 4th. The water was pitch black, contaminated, warm from the heat of the reactor above. They waded through corridors using blueprints to navigate, searching for the drainage valves. The radiation levels were extreme. Their dosimeters were screaming. It took them hours, but they found the valves. They opened them. Water began to drain. The mission was a success. All 3 men survived, contrary to later myths that claimed they died shortly after. They absorbed significant radiation doses, yes, and it likely shortened their lives. But they didn't die that night, or that week, or even that month. They lived for years afterward, though none of them enjoyed particularly good health. With the water drained, the next crisis was averted, but Legusov's work was far from over. Take a moment, if you'd like, to leave a comment about what historical disaster or event you'd like us to explore next. Or just check in and let us know how you're doing. You're an important part of our little corner of the internet, and we love hearing from you. As the immediate crisis stabilized, Legusov turned his attention to the long-term problem. The destroyed reactor couldn't remain exposed indefinitely. It needed to be entombed, sealed away from the environment. The solution was a massive concrete structure that would be built around and over the reactor building, essentially creating a giant sarcophagus. But before construction could begin, the area needed to be cleaned. The roof of the adjacent reactor building, Reactor 3, was covered with debris from the explosion. Chunks of graphite, pieces of fuel, all lethally radioactive. This debris needed to be cleared before workers could safely approach to build the sarcophagus. Robots were tried first. The Soviets brought in remote-controlled machines designed to operate in high-radiation environments. They lasted minutes before the radiation fried their electronics. Western robots, borrowed from allies, fared no better. The radiation levels were simply too high for any machine to function, so they used men instead. Liquidators, they were called. Soldiers, mostly, along with civilians conscripted for the task. They were sent onto the roof in shifts lasting 90 seconds. 90 seconds to run out, grab debris with a shovel, throw it over the edge into the reactor hall, and run back. 90 seconds. That's all the exposure time they were allowed before they hit the maximum safe radiation dose. Though in truth, there was nothing safe about it. They were absorbing in 90 seconds what a nuclear worker might normally receive in an entire career. Legusov watched this and felt something inside him break. These were young men, many of them 20 years old, being sent to shovel radioactive debris with the most primitive tools imaginable. They weren't volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were conscripts, soldiers following orders, told that the motherland needed them. Over 3,000 men rotated through these 90-second shifts. Each one knew that they were sacrificing their health, possibly their lives. Cancer rates among the liquidators would be significantly elevated for decades to come. But the work got done. The roof was cleared. Throughout all of this, Legusov was also fighting another battle, one against the Soviet bureaucracy itself. His investigation into what caused the explosion was revealing uncomfortable truths. The RBMK reactor design had a fundamental flaw. Under certain conditions, it could become dangerously unstable. This flaw had been known, documented, but never properly addressed. The official narrative being pushed by Soviet authorities was that the disaster was caused by operator error. The men in the control room had violated protocols, had pushed the reactor into an unsafe condition. It was their fault, not a design flaw in a reactor type that was used in dozens of plants across the Soviet Union. Legusov knew this was only part of the story. Yes, there had been operator errors, but the reactor itself was flawed. Its design allowed for a situation where doing what seemed like the right thing, inserting control rods to shut down the reaction, could actually cause a power surge instead. The operators didn't know this. They hadn't been told. The design flaw had been kept secret. Speaking this truth was dangerous. It meant admitting that Soviet nuclear technology was flawed. It meant admitting that other RBMK reactors might be at risk. It meant challenging powerful people who had built their careers on this reactor design. In August 1986, Legusov was sent to Vienna to present the Soviet findings to the International Atomic Energy Agency. This was his chance to tell the world what really happened. But he was constrained by Soviet officials who traveled with him, who reviewed his presentation, who made it clear what could and could not be said. Legusov's Vienna presentation was technically brilliant, but politically sanitized. He explained the accident, the timeline, the response. He acknowledged some design issues, but emphasized operator error. The international community was impressed by his knowledge and candor, but Legusov knew he had only told part of the truth. Back in Moscow, he tried to push for design changes to the remaining RBMK reactors. Some modifications were made, but they were expensive and politically complicated. Progress was slow. Meanwhile, Legusov's own health was deteriorating. He had spent weeks at Chernobyl in the immediate aftermath, exposed to significant radiation. He was developing symptoms, fatigue, headaches, difficulty concentrating. But worse than the physical symptoms was what the experience had done to his faith in the system. Legusov had been a true believer, a communist who thought the Soviet Union represented humanity's best hope. Chernobyl shattered that belief. He had seen the lies, the cover-ups, the willingness to sacrifice lives to protect reputations and careers. He began to speak more openly about the real causes of the disaster. He gave interviews. He wrote reports that were increasingly critical of the nuclear establishment. He was warned to be quiet, to stop making trouble. His career stalled. He was passed over for promotions. His nomination to the Soviet Academy of Sciences, which should have been a formality for a scientist of his stature, was mysteriously blocked. On April 26, 1988, exactly 2 years after the disaster, Valery Legasov went to his office at the Kurchatov Institute. He had been battling depression, struggling with what he had witnessed, with what he knew, with his inability to force real change. He recorded several hours of audio tapes, detailing everything he knew about Chernobyl, about the design flaws, about the institutional failures that had led to the disaster. He explained the lies, the cover-ups, the truths that had been suppressed. These tapes were his testimony, his confession, his attempt to ensure that the real story would be known. Then he went home and hanged himself. His suicide note was brief. It acknowledged his depression, but also his frustration with the Soviet system's inability to learn from its mistakes. He was 41 years old, 2 years past his diagnosis with terminal illness caused by radiation exposure. After his death, his audio tapes were smuggled out and transcribed. They circulated among Soviet scientists, building pressure for real reforms to nuclear safety. The truth he had tried to tell while alive finally began to be heard. Changes were implemented to RBMK reactors. Safety culture improved. But it came too late for Legasov. Valery Legusov's story is a tragedy within the larger tragedy of Chernobyl. He was a brilliant scientist who tried to serve his country honestly and was destroyed by a system that valued appearances over truth. He helped prevent an even worse catastrophe in those first desperate weeks, but the experience cost him everything: his health, his career, his faith, and ultimately his life. His legacy is complex. Some see him as a hero who fought against institutional corruption. Others note that he was part of that same system for decades, benefiting from it, supporting it, only questioning it after disaster struck. Perhaps he was both, a man who believed in something until it failed catastrophically, and then had the courage, however belatedly, to speak the truth about that failure. You wouldn't have survived being Valery Legusov, because the radiation would have gotten you eventually, as it got him. But more than that, you wouldn't have survived the moral weight of what he carried. The knowledge that you were part of a system that caused a disaster, that lied about it, that prioritized politics over safety, over human lives. That knowledge, that guilt, that frustration with his inability to force change, killed him as surely as any radiation dose. In the end, Legasov's most important contribution might have been his death itself. His suicide, timed to the 2nd anniversary of the disaster, forced the Soviet leadership to confront what Chernobyl had really meant. It became impossible to ignore, to dismiss, to explain away. A prominent scientist doesn't kill himself over operator error. He kills himself over systemic failure, over lies he can't live with anymore. The Soviet Union would collapse 3 years after Legasov's death. Chernobyl didn't cause that collapse, but it accelerated it. It revealed the rot at the heart of the system, the gap between propaganda and reality. Legasov spent his final years documenting that gap, bearing witness to it, trying to force his country to face it. He failed in the short term, but in the long term, his testimony, his tapes, his willingness to speak truth even when it cost him everything, helped ensure that the real lessons of Chernobyl would eventually be learned. Not just technical lessons about reactor design, but deeper lessons about the danger of prioritizing ideology over reality, about the cost of lies, about what happens when a system becomes so committed to its own mythology that it can't acknowledge its failures until disaster forces the truth into the open. That was Valery Legasov's legacy, a truth that killed him to speak, but needed to be spoken anyway. The elephant's foot journey to the most dangerous object on Earth. In the depths of the Chernobyl reactor building, in a flooded basement corridor that no one was ever supposed to enter again. There exists an object so radioactive that it can kill you in minutes. It doesn't look particularly impressive in photographs, just a lumpy, wrinkled mass of material that vaguely resembles the underside of an elephant's foot. But this innocuous-looking formation is perhaps the most dangerous object ever created by human activity. This is the elephant's foot, and its very existence is a mystery that reveals the strange and terrible physics of what happened when Reactor 4 exploded. To understand the elephant's foot, we need to understand what happened in the moments after the explosion. When the reactor core was destroyed, it contained about 190 metric tons of uranium dioxide fuel. This fuel was arranged in long rods, held in channels within a massive graphite structure. The explosion scattered some of this fuel across the surrounding area, those chunks that firefighters picked up with their bare hands. But most of it, the majority of the reactor's nuclear fuel, remained in the building, and it was melting. The nuclear reaction had stopped. The explosion had seen to that. But the fuel was still producing enormous amounts of heat through radioactive decay. The atoms in the uranium and plutonium and all the other isotopes were breaking down, releasing energy, and that energy had nowhere to go. The fuel rods began to melt, liquefying at temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees Celsius. This molten fuel, mixed with melted metal from the reactor components, with graphite, with concrete, with sand and lead and clay from the helicopter bombing runs, created a new substance that had never existed before. A radioactive lava, if you will, though that term doesn't quite capture its strangeness. Geologists who later studied it would call it corium, a made-up word for a made-up material. The corium was unimaginably hot and unimaginably radioactive. It began to flow, seeking the lowest point it could reach, burning through metal and concrete like they were butter. It flowed through pipes, through cracks in the floor, dripping and oozing its way down through the reactor building's multiple levels. Some of it pooled in the reactor vault directly beneath where the core had been. Some of it flowed into adjacent rooms, and some of it, a particularly large mass of it, burned its way through to a basement corridor beneath the reactor hall and began to solidify there, cooling slowly into the formation that would become known as the elephant's foot. For months after the disaster, no one knew exactly where all the corium had gone. They knew it had flowed somewhere, that tons of molten radioactive material had escaped the reactor hall and was lurking in the building somewhere. But the radiation levels in the reactor building were too high for humans to explore safely. It was a mystery, and a dangerous one, because until they found the corium, they couldn't be sure it was stable, couldn't be certain it wouldn't reignite a nuclear chain reaction. The search for the corium fell to a special team of scientists and engineers, people willing to risk extreme radiation exposure to map the interior of the destroyed building. They used remote-controlled robots when possible, but the radiation kept destroying the electronics. So they went in themselves for brief missions measured in minutes, sometimes seconds. It was during one of these expeditions, in December 1986, 8 months after the disaster, that the elephant's foot was first discovered. A team led by a radiation researcher was exploring the basement levels with handheld dosimeters and cameras. They knew they were getting close to a major mass of corium because their dosimeters were going crazy, maxing out screaming warnings. They turned a corner in a corridor, and there it was. A large, solidified mass that had flowed down through a hole in the ceiling and then frozen in place against the wall, creating a formation that looked eerily organic, almost alive. Its surface was wrinkled and rough, like cooled lava, with what appeared to be layers visible in places where it had dripped and receded. The discovery was both exciting and terrifying. They had found a major portion of the missing corium, but the radiation coming off this thing was beyond anything they had anticipated. Standing in the same corridor, just a few meters away from it, the radiation dose was approximately 10,000 rentgens per hour. Let that sink in for a moment. 10,000 rentgens per hour. A lethal dose, the amount that will kill you, is around 500 rentgens total. This means if you stood near the elephant's foot for just 3 minutes, you would absorb a lethal dose. 5 minutes and you would receive about twice the lethal dose, guaranteeing a slow and agonizing death. 30 minutes of exposure would give you 5,000 rentgens, enough to kill you within 2 days. But even those numbers don't capture how dangerous this thing was. Those measurements were taken from several meters away. If you actually touched the elephant's foot, if you placed your hand on its surface, you would receive a fatal dose in less than 30 seconds. Your hand would begin to blister immediately. Within minutes, even if you pulled away, the tissue in your hand would be dying. Within hours, the radiation would have spread through your whole body, destroying your bone marrow, your organs, your DNA. The team that discovered it could only remain in the corridor for a few seconds at a time. They would rush in, take a quick photograph or measurement, and rush back out. Even so, those brief exposures were dangerous. Every second in that corridor took time off their lives. The photographs they took are haunting. In many of them, the elephant's foot is blurry, distorted by grains and artifacts. This isn't because of a bad camera. It's because the radiation was so intense it was affecting the film itself, creating noise in the image. The very act of photographing this thing was nearly impossible because the radiation was destroying the photograph as it was being taken. One of the most famous images shows a man standing in the corridor with the elephant's foot visible behind him. Or rather, there's a blurry shape that's supposed to be a man. He's barely visible, a ghost in his own photograph, because he couldn't stand still for the exposure time needed for a clear picture. He had to keep moving, had to minimize his time in the corridor. Standing still long enough for a clear photo would have killed him. Subsequent research into the elephant's foot revealed just how strange this material is. Analysis of samples, taken by remote-controlled devices or quick human missions, showed that it's a complex mixture. About 8% is uranium dioxide, the original reactor fuel. The rest is a bizarre cocktail: zirconium from the fuel rod cladding, steel and concrete from the building structure, graphite from the moderator, silicon from sand, even traces of the lead and boron that were dumped onto the reactor in the first days of the disaster. All of these materials melted together at extreme temperatures and then cooled into a new substance that has properties unlike anything found in nature. It's incredibly hard in some places, brittle in others. It's highly radioactive, of course, but the type of radiation varies depending on which isotopes are concentrated in which parts of the formation. Some areas emit primarily gamma rays, others beta particles, others alpha particles. Scientists studying it described it as both terrifying and fascinating. This was a new material created by one of the worst disasters in human history, and it didn't behave like anything they had studied before. In a dark, twisted way, it was scientifically unique, a window into physics that should never have been opened. Over time, the elephant's foot's radiation levels have decreased. Radioactive decay is always working, breaking down the most unstable isotopes. By the late 1990s, the radiation had dropped to around 800 roentgens per hour. Still lethal, still enough to kill you in less than an hour of exposure, but significantly less than those first measurements. By 2016, 30 years after the disaster, it had decreased further to around 80 roentgens per hour. This is still dangerous, still enough to cause severe radiation sickness with prolonged exposure, but no longer immediately lethal. You could theoretically stand in the same corridor as the elephant's foot for several minutes without receiving a fatal dose. Not that anyone would want to try, but the decrease in radiation levels has brought a new problem. As the elephant's foot and other corium formations cool and age, they're becoming brittle, they're cracking. In some places, they're crumbling. This is a disaster waiting to happen, because if these formations collapse into dust, they could create clouds of radioactive particles that would spread through the reactor building and potentially beyond. This is one reason why the new safe confinement, the massive steel structure built to replace the original sarcophagus, was so important. Completed in 2016, this structure is designed to contain Chernobyl for the next 100 years, long enough for most of the radioactive materials to decay to safer levels. It's equipped with sophisticated ventilation systems to prevent radioactive dust from escaping, and with remote-controlled cranes that will eventually be used to dismantle the reactor building piece by piece. But even with this containment, the elephant's foot remains. It's still there, still radioactive, still slowly decaying in that basement corridor, and it will remain dangerous for thousands of years. Some of the isotopes in the corium, like plutonium-239, have half-lives of 24,000 years. This means that in the year 26,000 AD, long after our civilization has likely crumbled, the elephant's foot will still be radioactive enough to cause radiation sickness. The existence of the elephant's foot raises uncomfortable questions about nuclear power and the accidents that can happen when it goes wrong. This object, this mass of deadly material, is the physical embodiment of a disaster. It's proof that when nuclear technology fails catastrophically, it creates problems that persist for geological timescales. There are other corium formations in the Chernobyl reactor building, probably quite a few of them, though the elephant's foot is the largest that's been studied in detail. Each one is its own mystery. How much fuel is in it? What isotopes are present? Is it stable? Could it potentially restart a chain reaction under the right conditions? That last question haunted researchers for years. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, there was genuine fear that the corium could become critical again, could reignite a sustained nuclear reaction. Water was the main concern. If water pooled around the corium, it could act as a neutron moderator, slowing neutrons to speeds where they're more likely to cause fission. This is why those 3 men had to drain the basement levels to prevent exactly this scenario. Even after the water was drained, the fear persisted. Rain could seep in, groundwater could accumulate. The original sarcophagus, built hastily in 1986, was never fully waterproof. For years, rain and snow would leak in, dripping down through the destroyed reactor building. Every time water accumulated near the corium, there was a tiny but real chance of criticality. Sensors were installed throughout the reactor building to monitor for signs of renewed chain reactions. Neutron detectors would sound alarms if they detected the signature of fission occurring. For decades, these sensors remained active, constantly watching, waiting for a disaster within the disaster. There were a few scares over the years, moments when neutron levels ticked upward and panic briefly set in. But each time, the levels would subside. The corium would remain subcritical, stable, just sitting there radiating and slowly decaying. The elephant's foot has become something of a dark legend among people interested in Chernobyl and nuclear disasters. It's been featured in documentaries, books, articles. People are fascinated by it, by this tangible piece of the disaster that you can see and photograph, even if doing so might kill you. There's something almost mythological about it, an object so dangerous that it can kill just by being near it. A cursed artifact created by human hubris, by pushing technology beyond safe limits. The elephant's foot is Chernobyl distilled down to its essence, deadly, permanent, a scar on the earth itself that will outlast nations and civilizations. And yet, in a strange way, it's also a monument to the people who discovered it, who studied it, who risked their lives to understand it. Those researchers who went into the reactor building in those early years, knowing that every second of exposure was shaving time off their lives, were acting in the service of knowledge. They needed to know where the corium was, how dangerous it was, whether it posed an ongoing threat. So they went looking for it, found it, documented it, analyzed it. Some of them paid for that knowledge with their health. Radiation exposure accumulates. Those brief missions into the reactor building added up. But their work answered critical questions and helped ensure that Chernobyl could be safely contained. The elephant's foot stands as a reminder that Chernobyl isn't really over. The disaster happened in 1986, yes. The immediate crisis was resolved. The reactor was entombed. The exclusion zone was established. But the radioactive materials created by the disaster are still there. Will be there for thousands of years, slowly decaying, never quite safe. You can't visit the elephant's foot, not safely. The reactor building is off limits, too dangerous for tourism. Only essential workers with extensive radiation training are allowed inside, and even they minimize their time near high radiation areas. The elephant's foot sits alone in its corridor, undisturbed, slowly losing its potency over timescales that dwarf human lifespans. In a way, it's fitting that one of the most iconic images of Chernobyl is something most people will never see in person, something that would kill them if they tried. The disaster created a world within our world, a zone where normal rules don't apply, where buildings stand empty and objects exist that are too dangerous to approach. The elephant's foot is the heart of that zone, the ultimate forbidden object, the thing you cannot touch, cannot approach, can barely even photograph without risking your life. It's a powerful symbol of the Chernobyl disaster, dangerous, mysterious, permanent, a problem created in seconds that will persist for millennia. Long after the last person who remembers Chernobyl has died, long after the Soviet Union is a footnote in history books, long after our current civilization has transformed into something unrecognizable, the elephant's foot will still be there, still radioactive, still deadly, still waiting in its flooded corridor beneath a ruined reactor. That's the true horror of Chernobyl, not just what it did to the people who were there, but what it created for the future. A legacy of contamination that will outlast everything we know. The elephant's foot isn't just an object. It's a promise, a guarantee that some mistakes last forever. Life in Pripyat, the city that died overnight. While firefighters were dying on the reactor roof and scientists were desperately trying to contain the disaster, ordinary life continued in Pripyat. For a few precious hours, the people of this model Soviet city had no idea that their entire world was about to end. Pripyat was built for Chernobyl, a purpose-built nuclear city designed to house the workers of the power plant and their families. Construction began in 1970, and by 1986, It was home to nearly 50,000 people. It was a young city, both in age and in demographics. The average resident was only 26 years old. There were thousands of children, teenagers, young couples just starting families, and it was, by Soviet standards, a paradise. Living in Pripyat meant access to goods and services that were rare in much of the USSR. The shops were well stocked. The apartments were modern, with amenities that ordinary Soviets could only dream of. There was a cultural center, cafes, restaurants, an amusement park under construction. People competed for the privilege of living here. A position at the nuclear plant meant not just good pay, but a good life. April 26, 1986, started as an ordinary Saturday. People woke up, had breakfast, made plans for the weekend. It was spring, warm and pleasant. The city's famous avenue of roses was beginning to bloom. Children were excited because the new amusement park was scheduled to open in just a few days, on May 1st, for the May Day celebrations. Nobody noticed the explosion at 1:23 a.m. It was 3 kilometers away, muffled by distance and buildings. Some people sleeping near windows reported hearing a thud, feeling a slight vibration. But in a city next to a power plant, strange noises at night weren't unusual. Most people slept through it entirely. The first sign that something was wrong came around dawn. Early risers noticed an unusual number of fire trucks racing toward the plant. The sky in that direction had a strange glow, and there was something odd about the air, a faint metallic taste that some people noticed but couldn't quite explain. By mid-morning, rumors were spreading. There had been a fire at the plant. Some people had been taken to the hospital. The fire brigade had been there all night, but official statements were minimal. Nothing on the radio, nothing in the newspapers, just whispers and speculation. What the residents of Pripyat didn't know was that they were standing in an invisible cloud of death. The wind that morning was blowing the radioactive plume from the reactor directly over the city. With every breath, they were inhaling radioactive particles. Iodine 131 was settling on every surface, on the grass in the parks, on the benches where people sat, on the playground equipment where children played. Iodine 131 is particularly dangerous because the human body concentrates it in the thyroid gland. When you breathe it in or consume it in contaminated food or water, your thyroid absorbs it like it would normal iodine. But this iodine is radioactive. It sits in your thyroid, emitting radiation directly into the surrounding tissue. Thyroid cancer is the result, often years or decades later. The children of Pripyat were absorbing massive doses of iodine 131 that Saturday morning, and nobody told them to stay indoors, to avoid the parks, to stop playing outside. Some residents, particularly those who worked at the plant or had connections to plant workers, were starting to piece together that something serious had happened. They called relatives, warned friends. Some people made the decision to leave on their own, packing bags and getting on trains or buses out of the city. But most stayed. After all, there had been no official evacuation order. Leaving felt like overreacting, like panic. Meanwhile, officials were debating what to do. Moscow had been informed. Scientists like Legusov were being consulted. Radiation measurements were being taken, and the readings were horrifying. In some parts of the city, particularly areas downwind of the reactor, radiation levels were hundreds of times normal background levels. But evacuation is a massive undertaking. Pripyat had 50,000 residents. Where would they go? How would they be transported? What about their belongings? And perhaps most importantly, from the Soviet government's perspective, how would it look? An evacuation would be an admission that something terrible had happened, that the great Soviet nuclear program had failed catastrophically. So they waited, they debated, they formed committees, and in Pripyat, people went about their Saturday. Weddings were held that day. Young couples, dressed in their finest, posed for photographs with the cultural center in the background, with the city's monuments, with the spring flowers. These photographs are heartbreaking to look at now, knowing what we know. The smiling faces, the celebration, all happening in a city that was already contaminated, already dying. Children played in parks. Teenagers gathered near the river. Families went shopping, walked along the boulevards, enjoyed the spring weather. Life continued, ordinary and unremarkable, while invisible radiation settled over everything. Some people noticed odd things: dogs acting strangely, pacing and whining, birds that seemed confused, flying erratically. A few observant residents noted that the leaves on some trees looked burned, wilted, though it was far too early in the season for that. These were signs of intense radiation exposure, but without context. They were just curious anomalies. By Saturday evening, roughly 18 hours after the explosion, the decision was finally made. Pripyat would be evacuated, but not immediately, not that night. The evacuation would happen Sunday afternoon. They needed time to organize buses, to coordinate with surrounding areas, to prepare. In the city, the first official announcement came Saturday night. A bland statement about a minor accident at the power plant, assurance that everything was under control, a suggestion that people stay indoors as a precaution. The word evacuation was not used. The word radiation was not mentioned. Some people took the announcement seriously and stayed inside. Others ignored it, went out to evening gatherings, to cafes, to visit friends. After all, if it was really serious, they would say so, right? The government wouldn't downplay something truly dangerous. Sunday morning, April 27th, the announcement came. All residents of Pripyat were to prepare for a temporary evacuation. Bring only essential items, documents, a small amount of food. Leave everything else. This was temporary, just a precaution. They would be allowed to return in a few days, once the situation at the plant was fully stabilized. This was a lie. The authorities already knew that Pripyat would not be habitable for decades, possibly centuries, but they feared panic. So they lied, told people this was temporary, encouraged them to leave their belongings, their pets, their entire lives behind. The evacuation began at 2 p.m. on Sunday. Over 1,000 buses had been requisitioned from across Ukraine. They lined up in convoys through the city streets, waiting. People packed small bags, gathered their children, locked their apartment doors behind them, expecting to return in a few days. The buses left in an orderly procession. 50,000 people, an entire city, being transported away from their homes. People looked out the windows as Pripyat receded behind them, at the apartment blocks, the cultural center, the unfinished amusement park with its bright yellow Ferris wheel. They thought they were seeing it for a few days. They were seeing it for the last time. The buses took residents to surrounding towns and villages, to temporary housing, to the homes of relatives. But the radiation had spread beyond Pripyat. The entire area around Chernobyl was contaminated to varying degrees. Within days, the evacuation zone expanded. More villages were emptied. More people were displaced. Eventually, an exclusion zone of 30 kilometers was established around Chernobyl. Over 300,000 people were evacuated from this zone over the following months. Entire communities disappeared. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned. Farms, schools, hospitals, all left empty. Pripyat became a ghost town. The apartments stood vacant, tables still set for meals that were never finished. In one apartment, investigators found a child's homework laid out on a desk, a math problem half solved. In another, someone had been doing laundry. Clothes still hung on a drying rack, frozen in time. The amusement park, that symbol of Pripyat's bright future, never opened. The Ferris wheel never turned with laughing children. The bumper cars never bumped. They just sat there, rusting, becoming one of the most iconic and haunting images of the disaster. In the days and weeks after evacuation, liquidators returned to Pripyat to begin the cleanup. They washed buildings, removed topsoil from parks, buried contaminated items. But the contamination was too extensive. The city could not be saved. Eventually, the cleanup crews left too, and Pripyat was sealed within the exclusion zone, off limits to all but scientific researchers and the soldiers who guarded the perimeter. Nature began to reclaim the city. Grass grew through cracks in the pavement. Trees sprouted from building foundations. Vines climbed apartment walls. Without human maintenance, without people to trim and cut and control, the forest started taking back what had been cleared for the city. Animals moved in. Deer wandered the streets. Wolves made dens in apartment buildings. Birds nested in the abandoned cultural center. These animals were radioactive, their bodies contaminated from eating plants and drinking water in the exclusion zone. But they were alive, thriving even, in the absence of humans. This created a strange ecological paradox. The exclusion zone, one of the most contaminated areas on Earth, became a de facto nature preserve. Radiation is harmful, yes, and animal populations in the zone show elevated mutation rates and health problems. But apparently, radiation is less harmful to wildlife than humans are. Without hunting, without habitat destruction, without roads and development, animal populations exploded. Pripyat became famous among a certain kind of adventurer. Urban explorers, photographers, thrill seekers. They began sneaking into the exclusion zone, into the city, to see this frozen moment in Soviet history. It was illegal and dangerous, both from the radiation and from the security forces patrolling the zone. But the images they brought back were mesmerizing. Empty schools with textbooks still on desks. Gas masks scattered on floors from hastily abandoned civil defense drills. Hospitals with rusting medical equipment. Patient records yellowing in filing cabinets. The swimming pool, the gymnasium, the hotel, all empty, all slowly decaying. In 2011, the Ukrainian government began allowing official tourism to the exclusion zone, including Pripyat. Guided tours with strict rules about where you can go and how long you can stay. Tourists walk the streets where 50,000 people once lived, photograph the rusting Ferris wheel, stand in the central square where families once gathered. The city has become a dark tourism destination, a place people visit to confront disaster, to see what happens when human civilization simply stops. The guides warn tourists not to touch anything, not to sit on any surfaces, to watch where they walk. The radiation levels in Pripyat are lower now than they were in 1986, but the city is still contaminated. Spending a day there exposes you to about the same radiation as a chest X-ray. Relatively safe in small doses, but not something you want to do regularly. What strikes visitors most is how ordinary everything looks. Pripyat wasn't some dystopian Soviet monstrosity. It was a normal city, a nice city by Soviet standards. The apartments are the same kind millions of people lived in across the USSR. The school looks like schools everywhere. The park could be any park. This ordinariness is what makes it so unsettling. This could have been any city. The people who lived here were just normal people, workers and families, living their lives. They had hopes and dreams and plans for the future. And then, in one night, it all ended. Not through war or natural disaster, but through a technological failure, through human error, through a system that valued secrecy over safety. The residents of Pripyat were victims of Chernobyl as surely as the firefighters who died from acute radiation syndrome. Their deaths were just slower, harder to measure. Elevated cancer rates among evacuees, thyroid problems, genetic damage passed to children, psychological trauma from losing homes, communities, entire ways of life. Some former residents have tried to return. In the rural areas around Chernobyl, a few hundred elderly people, mostly women, moved back to their ancestral villages despite the contamination. They're called the Samozli, the self-settlers. They couldn't bear to live anywhere else, preferred to spend their final years in contaminated but familiar homes rather than in safety among strangers. The government officially forbids this, but they don't forcibly remove the supposedly. These are old people in their 70s, 80s, 90s now. They grew up in these villages, raised families here, buried loved ones in the local cemeteries. For them, the radiation is an acceptable risk compared to the certainty of dying far from home. But Pripyat has no Samozli. The city is too contaminated, too close to the reactor. And perhaps more importantly, Pripyat had no deep roots. It was only 16 years old when it was evacuated. People had lived there for at most a decade and a half, often much less. There was no multi-generational attachment, no ancestral graves to visit. Pripyat was a Soviet creation, and when the Soviet system failed there, the city had no reason to exist. The new safe confinement, the massive arch built over the reactor, was completed in 2016. It's designed to last 100 years, long enough for the most dangerous radioactive materials to decay significantly. Plans are being developed to eventually dismantle the reactor building entirely, to clean up the site, to possibly reduce the exclusion zone. But even in the most optimistic scenarios, Pripyat will not be reoccupied in our lifetimes. The contamination is too extensive. The cost of cleanup would be astronomical, and perhaps most tellingly, there's no reason to rebuild. The Soviet Union is gone. The ideological drive that created nuclear cities like Pripyat doesn't exist anymore. If the exclusion zone is ever opened, Pripyat will likely be demolished, buried, erased from the landscape. For now, it stands as a monument, not an intentional one, not like the memorials that have been built to honor Chernobyl's victims, but a monument nonetheless, to the cost of technological hubris, to the danger of prioritizing progress over safety, to what happens when systems fail catastrophically. Walking through Pripyat, even on an official tour, even knowing you're relatively safe, there's an overwhelming sense of sadness. This was someone's home. That apartment building, now crumbling and overgrown, housed families. Those schools educated children who are now middle-aged, scattered across Ukraine and beyond. That hospital brought new life into the world, treated illnesses, saved lives. All of it abandoned because of one night, one disaster, one failure that spiraled beyond control. You wouldn't survive life in Pripyat, because there is no life in Pripyat anymore. The city died overnight, and unlike the people who were evacuated, unlike the firefighters and liquidators who at least had agency in their fates, the city had no choice. It was simply abandoned, left to decay, transformed from a symbol of Soviet progress into a symbol of Soviet failure. The residents of Pripyat lost their homes, their community, their sense of place. Many lost their health too, though the effects were slow and often deniable. The Soviet government provided compensation, relocation assistance, but how do you compensate someone for losing their entire world? Former residents describe a strange grief, mourning for a place that still exists but can never be home again. They can visit as tourists now, walk the streets they once knew, but they can't stay. They can't return to their apartments, can't gather in the cultural center, can't send their children to the schools. Pripyat exists, but only as a ghost, as a memory made solid. In a way, the city's fate mirrors the broader story of Chernobyl. Lives disrupted, futures cancelled, a promise of progress turned into a legacy of contamination. The disaster didn't just kill people in the immediate aftermath. It killed a community, killed a way of life, killed the certainty that technology and progress always made things better. Pripyat stands frozen in 1986, a time capsule of late Soviet life, preserved not intentionally but by disaster. And it will stand that way for decades more, slowly crumbling, slowly being reclaimed by nature. A city that died overnight and will take centuries to truly disappear. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed, unlike the people we just learned about. Sleep well.